evil things to me. They're wicked to me.
Including Sid?
Oh, he's the worst. He laughs at me secretly.
And belches quite a lot as well, I suspect.
That was the sound of Sid Vicious belching on the 11th of November 1977, just around the corner from Broadcasting House here in London. We will be talking about the Sex Pistols a little later. Welcome to the Rock's Back Pages podcast. My name's Barney Hoskyns. I'm sitting here with my esteemed colleague Mark Pringle.
Hello, Barney.
Hello. First, though, we are going to start by talking about Chic. Kind of in the same period as the Sex Pistols, but sort of almost like the opposite, the anti-Sex Pistols. So both of these great late 70s acts are featured on the homepage of Rock's Back Pages this coming week. We have 3 free features on Chic from that period, well, 2 from that period, one by the great Danny Baker, who was a huge Chic fan and turned me on to Chic, probably one of the writers that really turned me on to Chic. I'll never forget his Single of the Week review of Good Times in the NME. So Chic have a big box set coming out next week. I think it's called the Chic Organisation. So it's a lot of Chic stuff, but it's also stuff that Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards produced other artists like the great Norma Jean Wright's song Saturday, a great disco classic from 1978. I know I can speak for Mark when I say we both think Chic were just absolute gods of the dance floor.
Absolutely fabulous. I mean, for me, the sad irony is I saw the Pistols back in the day and I didn't see Chic. And actually, personally, I wish it had been the other way around.
It was the other way around for me. I didn't see the Pistols and I did see Chic.
Yeah,
I'm
so envious.
Well, I like that. I do like to be envied by you, Mark. I saw the now legendary Hammersmith Odeon show in the autumn of 1979, and it was absolutely stunning. I'd probably say it was the greatest live show I ever saw. And, you know, this was a live show by a disco group, and disco groups weren't really supposed to be great live acts.
Well, they weren't supposed to be groups.
They weren't real groups.
Disco was a producer's medium primarily. I mean, I personally loved disco. Did I love disco at the time? I loved Chic at the time because they had being a band, they had some sort of presence which, in a way, what appeared to be faceless disco artists didn't have. I've revised my opinion entirely on that, by the way, but certainly...
You're a complete disco whore now,
I'm a complete disco whore now, yeah. Yep, it's true.
But Chic they sort of were disco, but they transcended disco, didn't they? And I think that was because they wrote extraordinary songs with incredible melodies and grooves. And, I mean, in Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards, 2 of the greatest players of any instruments in any musical medium.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal. I mean, Bernard's bass playing is still just nails me to the floor. It's really something. And also, just to mention one other guy, is the piano players plural. I just love the way that those Chic songs are built on these big architectural piano chords. And that never gets talked about. And I think it's a really big part of what makes
I think that's
so
a brilliant
fabulous
point because it gave Nile and Nard a platform.
Yeah.
And really,
and space, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to call them pads would be
certainly not.
To minimise, they were far more than pads. It was beautiful, gliding kind of piano chords and these incredible grooves that were built on top of them, built on top of Tony Thompson's. Or sometimes bizarre drumming. I mean, it's brilliant choices he makes.
Also sometimes close to John Bonham than any sort of conventional funk drummer. I mean, he had a sort of a weighty smack to what he did. But anyway, we are both Chic freaks, and they're fabulous articles. The Danny Baker one. And Danny Baker, at a time when white rock papers did not write about that sort of black music, he was flying the flag for it all along.
He really was, Danny was. And I mean, there weren't many writers writing about disco on NME. And so for me, the way Danny wrote about disco, and some other writers, of course, David Sigerson, who we have, even Richard Williams was writing brilliantly about disco in that period. Richard, of course, got disco. Danny and others made me take that style very seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it's not meant to be taken seriously. It's meant to be about fun and frivolity and
dancing
and ecstasy and hedonism and dancing, of course, exactly. But, Chic you can listen to irrespective of whether you're anywhere near a dance floor, I think,
True.
So we also have a retrospective piece by Darryl Easley, who wrote the book on Chic, the splendidly named Everybody Dance, Chic and the Politics of Disco. We love Darryl. Darryl was last seen at the Louder Than Words Festival last weekend, I think chairing a panel about glam versus prog, and Darryl arrived with an enormous Rick Wakeman-style cape, which he wore for the entire panel. And we love Darryl, one of just the loveliest and funniest writers we have on our books. So that's Chic for you. Also free on RBP this week are the words of David Hepworth, who came on board the Good Ship Rocks Back pages, I suppose, about a year ago.
That long ago?
He held out for that long.
Right.
We were trying to get his signature for many years, and I knew Dave back in the EMAP days when I worked on Mojo. Dave has reinvented himself as an author of some repute and some considerable sales. He's a real bestseller. There's a kind of Dave Hepworth brand now, starting with his book about 1971, and then Uncommon People, and he has a new book out called Nothing Is Real, which is I believe the subtitle is something about how the Beatles were underrated and other sweeping statements about pop. And Dave's a very amusing guy. He was obviously part of that great double act with Mark Ellen. And we've got two pieces from Smash Hits, actually, because that's where they started together.
I mean, David Hepworth was one of the kind of founder writers for Smash Hits. Now, Smash Hits, Barney and I were both massive readers of the music press at the time. Sort of Smash Hits came out of left field for us because it was a nakedly pop paper aimed essentially at a teenage pop buying market. It printed lyrics and all that sort of stuff. But first of all, it was edited by Nick Logan, the great NME editor. And he had obviously spotted a hole in the market where pop music could be written about knowingly and well, but in the context of teenage paper. And he hired people like Neil Tennant and all kinds of fabulous writers. And did I read Smash Hits at the time? No, I was an NME guy. But now in my job as the archivist here, I read it all the time. What a fabulous paper it was, certainly in the very end of the 70s through to the mid-80s. It was an absolutely tremendous magazine.
Very well put, Mark. I mean, it really was the Bible of pop. It was kind of the anti-NME. And as you say, Logan, who is a very canny publisher, saw this gap in the market, saw that teenage pop fans were essentially being neglected.
Yeah. It clearly hit almost instantly because it started off as a monthly, and within, I think, about 3 months it had gone bi-weekly. They wouldn't have done that if the thing wasn't selling in large quantities. It was very brash to look at, very colourful, printed lyrics, lots of photographs. No huge, long, meaty piece. We're talking about 1,000-word sort of top whack. But it reads brilliant. Old issues now read brilliantly.
Yes.
Just great.
I mean, I can remember when I worked on the NME in the early 80s, the Smash Hits office was across the street on Carnaby Street, and we sort of looked down on them while...
literally,
literally, while also feeling somewhat threatened by them, because we understood that this was a kind of new pop generation coming through that didn't take music as seriously as we were all still taking it.
I think they influenced the NME, curiously, in that people like Paul Morley started writing about nakedly pop acts fairly shortly afterwards. Suddenly you get Paul Morley doing a 3,000-word or a dollar, for God's sake.
That's a very good point.
And I think that was to some extent a response.
And Hepworth and Ellen, of course, then went on to found Q magazine, which was a more direct threat to the NME ethos and aesthetic. And I had mixed feelings about what Q stood for, but I really understood that, again, they had spotted a gap in the market, which were, I suppose, sort of, what Hepworth later went on to coin the term 50 quid blokes.
Yeah.
And so this sort of nascent or boomer generation of 50 quid blokes who couldn't really understand the NME anymore.
Sure.
And for whom Q was a very handy way of being educated as to what was really happening in pop culture.
Q also had a fairly retro aspect to it, which pointed directly to the following on Mojo magazine, for example. I mean, with no Q, I don't think you'd have got Mojo. I think it proves there was a hunger for people, as I say, 50 quid bloke who could buy a bunch of CDs to read about the stuff that he had, and it usually was he had grown up with.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lovely piece about Ian Dury by David from Smash Hits. Also Madness, a cover story on Madness, both from 1979. So pre-Q, obviously way pre-Mojo, and then bring it more up to date. There's a review from The Word, which he was also involved in with Mark Ellen and Paul Denoyer again, from 2003, which is it's essentially a piece about the CD, the very belated CD release of Neil Young's On the Beach, which is a sort of timely thing, given that Neil's house burned down in Zuma Beach or Malibu Beach, leading to Neil issuing some very stern words about Trump's comments on forest management. On the Beach, one of my favourite albums. I think. Your favourite.
That's my favourite Neil Young period. The sort of On the Beach, Zuma, Tonight's the Night stretch. It's about 3 or 4 albums in a row, which
the Doom trilogy, as it's been.
Is that
done.
right?
Yeah. The Doom trilogy. On the Beach actually came out in 74, before Tonight's the Night, but actually was recorded after it. That's the story. And of course, then there's Time Fades Away, which did finally come out on CD. I mean, these are incredible. I mean, to me, they're my favourite Neil Young records, I think. On the Beach, Tonight's the Night, Time Fades Away, Zuma. I really, really love all those records. They're the sort of darkest records Neil ever made. Anyway, Hepworth's very good on them, and there's tons more Hepworth on Rock's Back Pages. His new book is, as I say, is called Nothing Is Real, which of course comes from Strawberry Fields Forever.
Yes, you're right.
Am I right? Am I right? Okay.
Yes.
Good. So we'll move on from Chic and David Hepworth to the notorious but lovable Sex Pistols.
Yes.
We really have an absolute kind of bit of a goldmine for you this week in this almost hour-long audio interview with Johnny Rotten, as he then was, and Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols, recorded for Radio 1 in November 1977 by John Tobler, who many of us know best from Zigzag magazine.
That's right, yeah.
And it is just, I have to just say, it is probably the funniest audio interview on Rock's Back Pages.
Well, the one thing about this audio is that basically they're rude about everyone. One person after another they're rude about. You name it, including each other. This first clip is them being particularly rude about their manager, Malcolm McLaren. And actually, the thing is that Sid Vicious plays the fool, but he's laceratingly accurate in this.
A question that's occurred to me is that Malcolm, who I know you hold in great esteem.
Oh, that I hate Malcolm.
Yeah, I've read that once or twice. He was originally a Stones fan, I believe.
Typical. He was a miserable little artist from the East End, with pretensions of being middle class. He's in his house, in his closet in Clapham. He's got this really ridiculous picture of this awful load of scribble, and
It's meant to be a chair.
it's meant to be a chair. And he was going, well, you'll see.
Every time you go
It's
in
meant
there,
to signify the flow of air around the show now. And trying to be all artistic and impress us, and we were laughing our heads off, thinking, what an idiot. It was great. And there's that poxy Vivienne squawking away in the corner, sewing things up. babbling away to herself, the old bag. I hate her as well.
Well, why in that case, why do you put up?
Because we like them. They're our friends.
I see. No, it occurred to me.
Where would we be without Malky Walky?
I can't say.
We'd be the new Beatles.
So that was Sid dissing Malcolm McLaren. If you're a subscriber, if you would like to subscribe to RBP, there is so much more where that came from. It's so funny. I was listening to in the gym last night and I was laughing out loud, rather embarrassingly. I was literally wetting myself because it is so funny.
That wouldn't happen with me because the chances of me... last time I was in the gym was probably like in the 4th year at school, so...
They had to call an ambulance, didn't they?
But anyway, it's great. And we'll be playing another couple of snatches later on. But
we really will. So, Pistols, what can we say about the Sex Pistols?
I mean, in the interview, they're incredibly rude about Glenn Maxwell. I think, their 3rd ever show when they played Chelsea School of Art in November '75.
At which you were a student?
At which I was a student. And a couple of things. First of all, I remember the gig like it was yesterday, and there's a lot of gigs I've completely forgotten. Did I think they were much good? No, I didn't. I thought, the bass player's good, and of course that's Glenn Maxwell.
Who they're fantastically rude about.
Fantastically rude. Also, there's the wild-head guy by the mixing desk was Malcolm McLaren. I found him weirdly transfixing. The place was half empty. Viv Albertine was there, and she went on to form Slips, and I didn't do a great deal. And Rotten was shouting from the stage, "You're all too old, you're all too old." And I remember actually thinking at the time, he's right. Of course, the irony is he's exactly 1 day older than me, so...
Very good. There's a bit where Tobler asks them, or I think asks Sid specifically, what bands he actually likes, given that he appears to dislike almost everyone. And he says, I like the Slits, which I found very endearing, and the Ramones. Sid is so funny in this. I mean, he sort of plays the doofus, but it's so funny. It's like a couple of brilliant comedians doing Vicious and Rotten. You almost can't believe it's real. But the
other thing is that Sid's accent sort of slips because he's a lot more middle class than he made out. He sort of talk like that, and every now and again he kind of goes into sort of grammar school speech, and it's kind of quite endearing.
I love it when he's talking about Jean-Paul Sartre.
Sartre.
Jean-Paul Sartre.
But he clearly read him. That's the thing you get from that.
I didn't necessarily glean that.
No, I did, because he says something beyond that, which is an absolute direct reference. So, probably at school, he had read Sartre.
And talking of Sid Vicious's school days, of course, our colleague and partner Martin Collier, one of the original co-founders of Rock's Back Pages, was at school was John Beverley?
Yeah, John Beverley.
And
Sid
then Vicious.
Years later, he bumped into a tube train when Sid had become Sid, and apparently Sid looked at him, and Martin looked at Sid, and they sort of didn't acknowledge each other, but clearly there was recognition.
And talking of Sid, he says, doesn't he, in the interview, I always hated the name Sid, so they started calling me Sid. There's just such sort of cruelty and malevolence there beneath the humour, but
it's great.
It's just fantastic. Yeah. I was so thrilled.
The other thing to say is that Tobler handles the thing brilliantly. Sid is demanding cigarettes and cups of tea and belching, and Tobler, where a lot of people would have done a Bill Grundy.
Yes.
Tobler really handles the whole thing very well. He does,
doesn't he? He does, and they don't for 1 minute. You expect them to attack Tobler at some point. I mean, they must have known about Zigzag, and so Tobler would have sort of embodied that kind of West Coast thing.
Zigzag's probably where Johnny Rotten used to have learnt about Van de Graaff generator from. He was probably a regular Zigzag reader.
That's right. And Sid also just he almost does a kind of with nail, doesn't he, when he's sort of going, bring me a cigarette, I demand a cigarette. It's just brilliant. So there we go. We must stop talking about the Sex Pistols, although we can't get enough of them. So we're now going to look at what is going into the Rock About Pages library this week. And so, Mark, take it away.
Yeah, a few highlights. Again, it's Dawn James, this time writing under her pseudonym Jean-Marie. She wrote under about 4 different names for Rave, because Rave had about 2 writers, and they would do different names. She interviewed Sandy Shaw, and it's really charming because Sandy Shaw, she says, because I'm 17, I'm told to take advice and do as people bid. I think, what's so different about being 17 that I can't decide for myself? If I let people sway me now, I'll be letting them when I'm 18, 21, 30. Shouldn't I be myself now and always? And I love that quote because, you know, she is clearly surrounded by people telling her what to do. And, you know, she's a tough young woman who's got a very clear sense of herself.
Absolutely.
Again, this is Dawn James, great writer, who we'll hopefully feature further on this podcast. We got a Geoffrey Cannon unpublished interview with Nico from 1970, which is kind of a curious one. Basically, the questions are always 4 times longer than the answers. That Nico sounds pretty depressed. And she says, I suffer from oblivion. That is part of my being able to survive. Because if I were obsessed by all the things that I can remember, I'd just go insane. Yeah, it's an interesting one. And that leads naturally on to the next one I picked out, which is Nick Kent's interview with Lou Reed from 72. Lou Reed in 72 was in a pretty interesting position. The Velvets had broken up a year before. He'd done 1 solo album to no great sort of impact, but had just been seized upon by David Bowie in the Ziggy Stardust period of Bowie. And I think, did Lou support Bowie at some shows? I think, but he was certainly...
They played together at the festival hall.
That's right. And he was also recording what became Transformer. He said, my first solo album was all love songs. This is all hate songs. It's going to be called Transformer. And, you know, Nick Kent is... Probably, I suspect it's his first introduction to Lou Reed, the difficult interviewee. But it's pretty interesting stuff.
And Nick had just started on the Enemy, really, at that time, I think.
It was
72.
very early, yeah.
So for him, you know, Lou Reed and Iggy Pop were already iconic figures and precursors of punk. And I think he makes that point in the piece, doesn't he?
Yeah.
That Lou is so influential, has clearly been so influential on David Bowie. And of course, we should mention Mick Ronson here because I think when I interviewed Lou Reed in the 90s, he made the point that Mick had ultimately and musically more to do with Transformer than Bowie did. Bowie would just sort of wander in occasionally, but really Ronson was the kind of musical arranger on that.
Absolutely. In fact, Lou, in this interview, sings Ronson's praises as a guitar player, but also he very much makes it clear that Ronson is as involved as Bowie is in the production of the album, as you say, actually more so. So yeah, that's a very good point.
Lovely.
1980 in the NME Guide to Electronic Music by Andy Gill. Now, 1980, you know, since been around since the dawn of prog, probably about 5-8 years before. But 1980 was really the first time that cheap analog synths becoming available, and that English musicians in particular were seizing on them to produce what became electropop around that time, and about a year or so later. And it's the first part of a fairly extensive guide. And he says, sooner or later we'll all come to terms with the fact that, despite its inferior posing quotient, the synthesizer may eventually challenge and supplant the guitar as the most common instrument in pop music. It's an ultra-soporific mixture. And then another quote about Tangerine Dream. It's an ultra-soporific mixture, and there remains some doubt as to whether anyone actually consciously heard the closing minutes of Tangerine Dream or Edgar Froese album. It's a very good piece. It covers everything from sort of the German avant-garde through to krautrock and so on and so forth.
And Eno.
And minimalism and so on and so forth. So for 1980, it's a remarkably prescient and well-written piece about electronic music.
Excellent.
And a delightful interview with the always delightful Luther Vandross by Jeffrey Himes from the Baltimore Sun in 1982. And there's 3 great quotes here. My idea of a great record is that you focus in on the record player so totally that if somebody taps you lightly on the shoulder, they'll give you a heart attack. Another one is, someone should be able to rob your house while you're listening to a ballad without you knowing it. And the last one is about his family. My mum used to know how to handle us. If my brother was bad, it was no basketball. If I was bad, it was no Shirelles.
Wonderful.
You've interviewed him.
I did interview Luther Vandross, and it was a great privilege to meet him. I was a huge fan.
Yeah,
and those
me
quotes
too.
really sum up what music meant to him.
Yeah.
There were an awful lot of R&B singers in that era who you felt were more concerned with their kind of look, their looks and their clothes and their success with women or whatever it might be. Luther really cared enormously about the craft of his music, of his songs and the production. He had these incredible musicians around him like Marcus Miller, and he immediately stood out for me among those kind of R&B love men of the sort of early 80s really.
Which wasn't a great period for R&B. Drum machines were very much coming in. The whole sound of R&B was becoming very flattened out in certain ways. And even though he had some of those production values, the care and attention he put, both not just into his singing, but the whole sort of process. And of course, he went on to produce some pretty serious records for other people, Jump to It by Aretha Franklin and others. And for me, if I've got a top 10 single records of all time, I'd say his version of Bacharach and David's A House Is Not a Home is bang in that top 10. It's just one of the most beautiful records ever made.
It's wholly immersive piece of music, isn't it? And you're absolutely right. You could listen to that and someone tapped you on the shoulder and you probably would have a heart attack. I mean, I think he was extraordinary. I really do think he was close to genius, Luther. Of course, tying in with Bowie, who we were speaking about earlier, he was the guy who came up with the vocal lick on Young Americans. He was a big part of Bowie's tour, the Young Americans tour and all of that. So I just think Vandross's records really
they sound
stand
better.
up.
I think they sound
very
better now than they did.
I mean, the Any Love album,
that's great.
I think is a masterpiece, actually. Both the up-tempo and the ballad stuff, he's incredible.
And lastly, from my set of choices, last week we talked about Marianne Faithfull at a time when she was deep into her addictions and so on and so forth. And this week we're running a live review from 1995 in The Guardian by the wonderful Caroline Sullivan. We talked last week about how Marianne became this wonderful sort of aging diva of rock. And Caroline writes, actress to the last, she was playing a character. She sang torturely, pulling out most of the stops, and was brilliant. Dragging her low register along the ancient blues ballad, Trouble in Mind, she was an archetype hitherto neglected by English pop, the upper-class woman of a certain age.
Fabulous.
So that's, it's a really nice, very sympathetic live review.
I have interviewed Marianne a couple of times, and she is always good value. We did talk about her last week, so we probably don't need to say much more about her. Have you got any other treats in store?
No, that's my lot.
There's
a couple of things worth mentioning. There's a live review from '77 of Gene Clark at the Whiskey. Gene Clark's just such a fascinating character,
I love Gene Clark.
You do,
I have to say,
rather more than me, it has to be said.
It is a slightly depressing and sad review of what clearly was, Gene kind of running out of steam.
Yeah.
But to me, he's the most beguiling and enigmatic of all the Byrds. I think his earlier songs on the early Columbia albums are the greatest things on them. To me, just because there's this sort of haunting folk poetic quality about them. So things like Set You Free This Time, they're so different from what McGuinn or Crosby or anyone else would do.
Certainly version one of the Byrds was never the same again after he left. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, people focus more on Crosby's departure and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But in terms of the sound that band made and the songs that they played, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, fantastic. And of course, his album No Other is one of the great cult records to come out of LA in the 70s, and I think it's an extraordinary sort of mystic masterpiece.
Is the documentary on Netflix? There's a fairly major documentary on one of the catch-up services.
I haven't seen it on Netflix, and I haven't seen it, and I would love to see it.
If any of you can find it, it's well worth watching.
Do phone in. So I haven't much to add other than say that in there's some of the pieces that have gone in from the last sort of 15, 20 years, there's another timely Neil Young involved piece by Tim Cooper from the Independent 2005, I think it is. 2008. And it's an interview with Neil about his Living with War album, but also about the tour that he'd done with Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Deja Vu tour, and a DVD had come out of that. And there's just an interesting bit, given the times we're living in here, I'm just going to read this bit. In the most memorable scene, writes Cooper, hundreds of audience members walk out of a show in Atlanta in protest at the quartet, encouraging them to sing along to Young's song, Let's Impeach the President. And he goes on, seemingly oblivious to the almost comical irony of leaving a freedom of speech concert in protest at the singers expressing their own freedom to speak out. They air their fury on camera as they leave. Neil Young can stick it up his ass, fumes a female fan. Son of a bitch, I'd like to knock his teeth out, a red-faced man declares. Young seems unconcerned. Well, they were speaking out too. He chuckles behind his shades. They were just saying, fuck you, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy crossing my line.
Yeah.
Well,
that's America today,
plus ça
isn't it?
change, plus la même chose,
Yeah.
right? Neil sounding off about Trump last week. Scary times we're in. Is music really confronting those times and the fears that we're all gripped by now? What can music do? Does music have any kind of political teeth anymore?
I don't think so. I think that on a local level it can. I think grime and its various successes in London is very specific, London-centric discussion about the lives of young black people in this city. But music's too diffuse, there's too much of it. It's too spread, it's too thin, it's too packaged, and I just don't think that... Let's be honest, that music never had much political resonance. We look back on Dylan as some sort of, acme of that. But, music was always the accompaniment to other movements and wider ideas. The rebellions, inverted commas, of the 60s would have happened anyway. It just so happened that it happened at a time when music was particularly important to young people. But I don't think we can delude ourselves that music has the power to change minds.
I think in some ways, we're all still haunted, even those of us who didn't live through that period, by the fact that music didn't change the world.
Yeah.
The radical politics of rock culture in the mid to late 60s didn't actually do what they said they were going to do. And I think there's a sort of sense of grief and loss there that's permanent in the culture.
I'd actually want to turn it around. I'd say that the very people who were the keenest on the music actually proved to be the most neoliberal and reactionary of the lot in many respects. So you look at Silicon Valley; it's full of the fragments of. Steve Jobs is a classic example. The fragments of the hippie protest generation, and it all became about me, and about my rights. It wasn't about our rights. It was never about collective action. It was always about what's good for me. And it's dressed up in an elaborate language of liberation and freedom. But actually, when it boils down to it, it's about them stealing all our data and screwing us over. So,
well, and talking of radical musical politics, why don't we bow out with some more words from the guys behind Anarchy in the UK? Another clip of Messrs Vicious and Rotten talking to John Tobler in November 1977.
The title of the album you did put out, whose decision was it to call it Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols?
Ours. Steve always says that is his catchphrase.
It was something that Steve always used to say.
Because he's rude.
And decadent.
Uncouth.
And fat.
Very fat.
Oh, but he's not here to defend himself.
He couldn't defend himself even if he was the ignorant slob. We hate him. We plot against him every night.
But he's still-
And they plot against me as well.
Why do they plot against you, Sid?
Because they say that I'm a shit bass player. And that I can't play nothing and that I'm stupid.
That isn't a plot, that's just a fact. My life.
No, that's what
Don't get above your station, piece of lowlife.
That was an excerpt from Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols chatting to John Tobler, concluding this week's Rock's Backpages podcast. The presenters were Barney, Hoskyns and Mark Pringle, and the producer was Jasper Murison-Bowie. You can find all the articles they talked about, and thousands more, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews at rocksbackpages.com.